You good? All right. We'll go ahead and get started. We're going to try to finish up Luke 16 today. Um, we've been talking about the story of Dives and Lazarus, or the rich man and Lazarus. We've really been talking about what this text has to say about the doctrine of hell and what many people have to say about the doctrine of hell based on this text. We've spent a lot of time talking about looking at this text as a parable or not, and why I find that to be very problematic because of what it does to the parables. So that I find to be very unacceptable. I am actually not opposed, and we're going to try to get to that today. I'm not opposed at looking at this as being a hypothetical situation, that there wasn't a specific man named Lazarus who lived, and that it's more of a hypothetical where he's hypothetically portraying what happens when after people die. I'm not opposed to that. I'm not saying that's what I think it is, but I understand why people would have objections to looking at this as a specific individuals that actually lived, and that Christ is like pulling back the curtain of eternity on these exact specific individuals. I understand the objections that are there, and I sympathize with some of those. I sympathize with those who look at this and have a hard time wanting to take it extremely literally. I understand some of the difficulties there, and I want to kind of look at those today, and I want to try to look at it balanced from both sides, because I do, and at least for me, I understand. Now, this may be abhorrent to you. You may think this is just horrible, and that if anyone would even suggest such a thing, it's just like practically heresy. I don't see it that way, but I have a very serious problem with trying to make this a parable simply because you want to try to resolve some complications, because that does tremendous damage to the whole genre of the parables of Jesus and how they're to be interpreted, which I don't think are something that we can lightly mess up, because they are very, very important. And I find that people that want to do that don't understand the importance of the parables. They don't get how important those parables are for Christian doctrine, that things are taught in the parables that are not taught anywhere else in the Bible. So when we start messing up what the parables are and how they are constructed and designed, I think we lose a lot. And all of it to gain what exactly? I don't know. I can't figure out what exactly they think they're gaining, because it doesn't resolve any problems in Luke 16. None. It creates a lot of problems, right? You say, well, Luke 16 is a parable. Okay, fine. Let's entertain that for a moment. What does it all mean? What do all the elements mean? Well, they don't know. Essentially, they come out saying they mean what they say. It's like you haven't solved anything, and you've created a ton of problems, and you've completely messed up the whole idea of the parables. So you've ruined that, and you haven't fixed this. So, there's that. I don't want to rehash all that. You can go back and look at the recordings. We dealt with that probably even more than I probably should have. But I find it to be very important, because I think the parables are that important. So anything that messes with them, I'm going to be against it, basically. So let's talk now about Luke 16. We won't have it. Kelly's not here, and I don't know that anyone else knows how to do that. So you'll have to look it up in your own Bible. Oh, the horror. But we'll be in Luke 16. Like 19 on is where the text is, and we'll get to that in a minute. So let's talk about a few things. I'm trying to wrap up a number of things that are not necessarily exactly connected, but we ought to wrap up if we're going to talk about hell. One is the words that are used in both the English translation or Spanish, if you're a Spanish speaker, and those that are used in the Greek and the Hebrew original writings. So let's talk a little bit about that, because if you ever have any type of conversation with anybody on hell, particularly like, let's say, Jehovah's Witnesses or those that lean in that direction, well, this is certainly going to come up, so I think we ought to deal with it a little bit. Okay, so in Hebrew, you have essentially one word that's used wherever you find, pretty much everywhere you find hell in your English translation. There's one Hebrew word that they're translating, and that's Sheol, which is Sheol. And that's not how it's spelled in Hebrew. They got different alphabet, obviously, but that's basically how it's pronounced, right? And we translate that, our English Bibles translate that with a lot of different words. So you'll have hell and grave and death and pit, and there's several others, but those are the main ones. So wherever you're reading and you say that in the Old Testament it uses the word hell, they're translating Sheol to hell, or they'll translate grave, or they'll translate it as death, as pit, and a few other things. And that's because that word has a lot of different meanings, just like English words have a lot of different meanings. Okay? So whenever you're translating, and this we'll have let's have a brief discussion on translation. If you don't know more than one language, then you probably have a very simplistic view of how translation works. Okay? Unless you've done some research into it or you know two languages, you probably don't really understand translation very well. I'm going to try to explain it very briefly. Translation is impossible. That's probably all you really need to know about translation. It is impossible. You cannot say in one language what you are saying in the other. You can approximate it, right? You can approximate it. Whenever you translate from one language to another language, two things happen simultaneously. You gain meaning and you lose meaning at the same time. The words you translate into, the words you use for the translation, have other meanings that the original language did not have, and they lack meanings that the original language had. And there's no getting around that. It is impossible to surmount that problem. That's just translation. It's that way. It doesn't matter what language you're coming from. It doesn't matter what text you're translating. It doesn't matter how simple the translation is. Give you an example I use often. Two words. Three words because we contract it. I'm cold. If we translate that into Spanish, we don't exactly get that. We get something similar. I have a cold. Now that sounds pretty similar, but you would translate that very differently in Spanish. And so when you do this translation, you're going to gain and lose meaning, which makes translation in the simplistic sense that you can just take a text and just put it in another language and it means exactly the same thing. Nothing gained, nothing lost. That never, ever happens. Because words are such fluid, dynamic, amazing things. It's one of the most amazing things there actually is in the entire world, in my opinion, are words. The majority of my actual hardcover books are dictionaries. I love words, love them. Love them more than people. And so they're amazing things. They're incredibly complex creatures or machines that do amazing work. And it's very, very, very hard to translate them well. Very hard, right? So you end up having to translate the same word. You say, well, let's just translate Sheol as hell every time. Why would we ever not? It doesn't work that way. Because in context, you can look at that and say, but that's not what the author appears to have meant when he wrote that word. He used the same word because that word works in that language in those different contexts. But we have but in our language, we actually have a number of words we need to use in order to describe different things. And it would work the same way if we were going from English back into Hebrew. It'd be the same issue. It's not like Hebrew is this wonderful language and English is so shoddy that we just have to do it that way. All languages are wonderful. All of them are. They're all incredible. They all have tremendous strengths and weaknesses. You can have a language that has millions of words. The English language is the language with the most words of any language in history. It's amazing. Our dictionary, our largest dictionary, it's not exactly a fair comparison, but our largest dictionary is 26 volumes, I believe it is. It's huge. huge. Because we just take words, any word we hear, we just take it. And we just put it in. And we mispronounce it so that it can be ours. We Americanize it. We don't want none of that French nonsense. Buffet. That's all you can eat. Yeah, see? He speaks French. So that English has all these words, and other languages have fewer words. Like Hebrew has no vowels. Incredible. No vowels. That's amazing. Is one better than the other? No, that's not how language works at all. So anyways, going back. So we have this word Sheol. It's translated a lot of different ways in English, and in most Bibles it's translated with a lot of different words. Pointing that out as making some kind of point, like Jehovah's Witnesses will like point that out, well, it's because over there it's Sheol. That doesn't mean anything. Doesn't resolve anything, doesn't fix anything, doesn't prove anything. Nothing, zero. It's the kind of argument you use hoping you can just run over top of the opposition by saying something they don't understand. There is absolutely nothing wrong with your English translation using all these different words to translate one Hebrew word. There's nothing wrong with that. Just like there's nothing wrong that in other cases, your English translation uses one word to translate many words. It actually goes both ways. It works. Because it is about communicating as best possible the meaning of the author. That's what matters. And this is why in this church, I'll say we to not just say me, are so adamant that what you need to be reading is what it means. You need to be trying to understand what the text means. Okay. We won't get in that because I could go all day on that, so we won't. Let's get into just quickly to Hebrew. So in Hebrew, in Greek, the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek probably several hundred years before Christ. Maybe even earlier, I don't know. But it's very old. We have a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and they translated it, Sheol, as Hades. That's how they translate it. So in the Old Testament, if you read the Old Testament in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, well, you'll see the Greek word Hades, and that's wherever you would find Sheol. That's how they translate that, Hades. Now, that is not exactly a translation. Many of you, that may even ring a bell, Hades. If you've watched the cartoon movies or movies based on comic strips, and you probably are familiar with the whole idea of Hades being the underworld, right? The god of the underworld. Well, that's not made up by Disney. That's actually very old mythology. The Greek translators of the Hebrew Bible took a pre-existing word that stood for the pagan concept of the afterlife and the underworld and translated Sheol with that pagan word. Now you might think, that's terrible. That's what hell is. The word hell comes from pagan Norse mythology. It is the term used to denote the god of the underworld in pagan Norse mythology, and it turned into our word hell. We're doing the same thing. You'll actually find that this is very common. The idea that the biblical authors, and believe it or not, this may sound a little comical to some of you right now, but this was actually an Orthodox Christian view for a very long time. That the biblical authors invented or were given, depending on how you want to look at it, a unique spiritual vocabulary that nobody else had ever spoken before. Basically, they made up or were giving new, invented words to write the Bible in. Holy Greek. People believed that. Because you have to realize there's very little written evidence of Greek in that time era. Let's talk about in the year like 300 BC up until about 100 after Christ. Those 400 years, we don't have a lot of documents where we can go and see how did they speak in those days. So we have some that are very elevated, seem to be very elevated Greek by like the poets and the pagan poets. And then you have the New Testament that didn't look like any other documents we had, which we didn't have a lot of them, but they didn't look very much alike. The Greek was very different. The composition, the vocabulary, very different, okay? So they thought, well, they must have just made up all these words. They must have been using these spiritual, heavenly language, right? Speaking with tongues of angels. No. As archaeology took off, right, in the 1800s, they started finding thousands and thousands of documents from that time period. Thousands and thousands of them. Shopping lists, contracts, last will and testaments, declarations, all kinds of stuff. You know what they found out? The Greek that the New Testament is written in is street Greek. It's the Greek everybody spoke in. That's why they call it now Koine, Koine, which means common. It is the common, everyday layman's Greek. The biblical authors did not invent hardly any words. Now, there's a few. As far as we can tell, for instance, one of the biggest examples of a coined word that one of the biblical authors actually made up a word, as far as we can tell, is the word that Paul used to describe homosexuality. That appears to be actually particular to Paul, that he made that word up. Because we can't find any evidence that existed anywhere else outside of there in 1 Corinthians. It's one of the few cases. For the most part, your Bible was written with words that everybody used. That means they took nouns that were describing pagan concepts and they repurposed them to talk about the gospel. Just like you and I do every day. If that upsets you or offends you, then you definitely do not want to go read the etymological section of a dictionary. Because you're going to find out there are almost no words you can use. Almost all words have a long history that reaches way back and generally back into paganism. Almost all of them. There's almost no word that is not true of. And so when we look at the Hebrew and the Greek even, we're not looking at this elevated language. This is one of the reasons I find it so distasteful when Christian pastors and teachers try to act like if they can read Greek, they're practically touching the skirts of heaven. Give me a break. This is just another language, as pagan as any other language. Every one of them. Hebrew is not some magnificent heavenly language that God revealed to Adam. That is not what Hebrew is. People that have these views of language generally have not done any real research into language. That's not how language works at all. Language is this it's like water running down the street. And you could just, you might have an idea where it might run or how it might flow or what might happen later, but you don't really know because all of a sudden it just goes in a different direction and it sweeps stuff up and it mixes everything up and it just turns into something you wonder, how did this word ever become that? And we don't know. Just one day, sit down with a dictionary. It'll be one of the most fun experiences you've ever had, at least it is for me. And you just take a word and just trace it back etymologically, all the way back to all the things and everything that's come out of it and all the influence. And you wonder, how in the world did it's like everybody at some point in time in human history had a lisp. Because all these words just all of a sudden were like, what? How did you go from that to this? It's incredible. That's what happens in language. So they took Sheol and they turned it into Hades. All of a sudden, now we're talking about Hades, using the pagan concept of the underworld to talk about what the Old Testament deals with as Sheol, what we call hell, which we're now using the Norse mythological pagan word for it. So which one is right? I mean, if we're being technical, are we all supposed to do like some Christians do and they all start using like transliterated Hebrew or transliterated Greek so they can be like more pristine or technically accurate? That's not how language works. It just isn't how it works. All right. Then there's another word. So you have Sheol, which is the translation of Hades. You generally find that in the Old Testament, but it does appear in the New also. New Testament authors use the word Hades in their writings to speak of hell. We translate it as hell, right? But then there's another one they use, and it's called Gehenna, which is a transliteration of another Hebrew term, not Sheol. Gehenna is the valley of Heman, and the Hebrew works that out, right? But that's this, so apparently, and it's not exactly sure, and there's some dispute over this, but apparently it's a reference to a valley that was cursed because they believe that's where the sacrifices, where they sacrificed the children to the fires of Moloch and such. They think that's where it might have happened, and so it got connected to that and connected to being cursed, and then the valley was a valley of fire, and so then the lake of fire gets named Gehenna. And in your New Testament, if you were to go and look at the Greek text of your New Testament, you'll find that if it's not Hades, it's Gehenna, which is a transliteration of a very odd word coming out of Hebrew, signifying a valley that lies to the southwest of Jerusalem. And somehow that gets connected to the concept of eternal damnation. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses like to point all that out. The reason I'm bringing this up to you is because you ever have a discussion with Jehovah's Witnesses, you're likely to hear all that. Because they think that that somehow means that there is no hell. That because they're using some word, and they say that's where the bodies were burned, or whatever they say about it, that somehow means that because the word isn't technically accurate, that means that hell doesn't exist. Now, that's just a foolish way of looking at this. The biblical authors, just like you and I, appropriated whatever words were understood and available to communicate their ideas or their truth or their revelation. We do that every day. If you are talking to you as an adult, if you want to sit down and talk to a small child and explain them something, you'll likely use more of their language than your language. Unless your goal is to prove to them that you're smarter. Right? But if your goal is to communicate, then you try to figure out what language they understand and you put it into that terminology. And you can teach them a few new words and help them expand their vocabulary and expand their minds by doing so. But you have limitations in that. When I was in Mexico, my Spanish is not very good, but my vocabulary is pretty good because I like to read dictionaries, and that helps, right, with vocabulary. Helps a lot. So I always had the problem that they couldn't understand my Spanish because it was so bad, and they couldn't understand my vocabulary because it was too good. Which means you're like doubly cursed to maybe understood. You have to figure out who you're speaking to. So when I would go and speak in conferences, I found out that not every church was the same. Even though they're all within the same like 300-mile little square area, all these churches that we were associated with, they were all very different. They had a very different vocabulary. They constructed their sentence different. They used words differently. And if you really want to be good at communicating, it's really important to have some familiarity with who you're talking to and to try to cast what you're trying to say into their words. And the better you can do that, the better you're going to be able to communicate. That's what the biblical authors did. We find very clear difference between the language Paul uses in, say, Galatians, as what he uses in Romans, as to what's used in Hebrews. These don't sound exactly like. They're very different. That's one of the reasons why some people are very adamant Paul didn't write Hebrews. The Greek in Hebrew is very different than the Greek in Galatians. But the audience is also very different. The audience is very different. So they would use words and constructions that the people they were writing to could comprehend. This wasn't technical language. To look at the Bible and think that we're going to do a word study, like for instance on hell, and we're going to do it real technical and figure out what the etymology is, and that's going to give us some insight into the doctrinal truth of whether there is a hell or what hell might be like, that's very foolish. All right. So then, if we don't have precise technical terms coined specifically to convey inherent meaning within themselves, within the words themselves, then what do we have to understand what eternity looks like? Well, we have what Jesus taught, what the overall point of his message is, what the meaning of the context is. It doesn't matter if he used the word Hades. He's not validating the Greek concepts of the afterlife. He's using words they understand, but he is constructing them into meanings that they didn't understand. And that's what he does, I believe, in Luke 16. He takes words they all understand, but he puts them together and he explains something that reveals what happens after we die. And like we talked about last week, in my opinion, Jesus is the only reliable witness we have of that reality. Everyone else doesn't know what they're really talking about. I'm sorry to say. David didn't know. He never witnessed it. He may have been inspired, and he may have revelation, and he may have been brilliant. No doubt of all those things. But he never saw it. So to discard Luke 16, which is the witness of Christ, to embrace that of Solomon, does not seem like a good idea to me. I think we should understand, however, Solomon portrays eternity in the light of how Jesus does, not the other way around, which means I don't go to Ecclesiastes to figure out what hell might look like. Okay? Now, that is interesting, and that brings up something I want to reiterate what we also talked about last week. And that is that Ecclesiastes, ironically, is one of the best places in the Scriptures to figure out that there is a hell. It's really quite ironic because it's so abused, right? I mean, if you ever talk to anyone who wants to tell you that hell isn't literal, or that there is no torment, or that it's just like a metaphor for ceasing to exist, well, they're almost always going to run over to Ecclesiastes. But that's because they don't understand Ecclesiastes. The whole point of Ecclesiastes is that there is a hell and that there is a heaven. His point is very simple. His point is that that life is pointless and senseless if there is no judgment and reward. That's the point of Ecclesiastes. He is depicting how pointless and senseless it is. Pointless means that if 2 plus 2 equals 0, well, that would be pointless. We could never get anywhere. It would also be senseless in that it is illogical, right? 2 plus 2 equals 0 not only will not allow us to ever get anywhere, but it's incoherent besides. He's making that point in Ecclesiastes. Solomon is saying life without judgment is pointless. That's the whole thing of vanity of vanities, all is vanity. It's pointless. What use is it then? But it's also logically incoherent. So it's both things he points out. And how does he conclude Ecclesiastes in chapter 12? The last verse, he says, the sum of all things spoken, fear God, keep his commandments, he's going to judge every person. He says, that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying there is no judgment. I'm saying there has to be a judgment. Because if there isn't a judgment, then we're stuck in this pointless and senseless existence. And we could, you could say, well, things can be pointless and still be real. True. But they can't be pointless and senseless. So, even though I say that about Ecclesiastes, I want to be clear that Ecclesiastes actually is not against what Christ said. But if somehow it could be construed that way, I don't have a problem with that. Because Solomon has no eyewitness testimony of this reality. Jesus does. So we must take Jesus' word. Paul one time wrote and said, he says, if any man does not, I always remember these in Spanish. If any man does not, No. If any man doesn't assent, the word in Spanish is assent to the wholesome words of Jesus Christ. What's the word in English? Anyone remember? It's like agree with. Assent, the word in Spanish is literally translated assent, even though that's not the correct word in English. Anyways, if any man, Danny, he's over there pretending. He's like, I'm going to be one of the common people today, pretend I don't know. The normal people. Huh? I don't know. I don't memorize references. I think it's Timothy. If any man does not, I don't think so. That's right. He is puffed up and knoweth nothing, he says. Right? He's puffed up and knoweth nothing. It's very important you understand, and I want to make this point, even though it's a little bit off topic, but I think it's important because there is a concept, there is a belief, a view going around evangelicism, especially our kind of evangelicism, right? That we're very connected to Paul's epistles. That Paul somehow is the architect of the church. Comes from a misconstruing of 1 Corinthians. It's not true. That's not what he's saying there. We'll deal with that some other day. Jesus Christ is the architect of the church. It's very important you understand. Paul did not ever, well, I say ever, with a couple exceptions that I can find, and I've really looked for them, except for a couple places, like don't get married. Other than that, he didn't say anything innovative. He didn't even pretend to be innovative. He expounded and expanded the teachings of Jesus Christ. All the apostles did. They were adamant about that. They were explaining what Christ had taught them. You can find almost every element of the New Testament, you can trace it back to its root in the Sermon on the Mount. Almost all of it. To those 3 chapters. That's how important they are. Paul, I love him as a writer. I really do. He's my favorite author of any type, of anyone. I love how he writes. I love how he thinks. And I particularly like the things he's talking about. But he didn't come up with this stuff. It was revealed to him. Jesus Christ is the innovator. He shook the world with one speech. He fundamentally transformed the entire world with the Sermon on the Mount. Nothing's been the same since. We talk about Western civilization. What is that? It's nothing more than putting into political practice the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount. That is the whole of Western civilization. It's an amazing sermon, incredible. I would encourage you, read the Gospels. They are incredibly important, immensely important. They are the most important part of the Scriptures. They really are. All the rest, all the epistles are just expanding those concepts, which isn't to diminish them. I love the epistles. Right? You and I probably would never be smart enough to read the Sermon on the Mount and figure all that out. We're simpletons. We can barely remember where it's even at. So I'm very appreciative of people like Paul and James and Peter who took that apart and built it all up and showed what that depth is. All these seeds that were planted, they watered them and they grew, and there's this huge structure. But don't forget, this comes from Christ, not from anyone else. It's very, very important that we understand that ultimately we base our faith and our practice on the words of Jesus Christ. All right. This is not to try to put him in contest with any of the other biblical authors, but it's very important to maintain that priority. And I would tell you, I think without reservation, that any of the biblical authors would tell you the same thing. Listen to him. All right. So, let's get on into Luke 16 a little bit and talk a little bit about the objections that many have to taking this story, quote unquote, literally. Now, those of you that have been around here for a while know that I really dislike that word because it is one of the most abused and misunderstood and misused words in the English language, particularly when we're talking about in the context of the Bible. It's like, what does it mean to be literal? They're like, that's not literal. What does that even mean? They have no idea what that means. It's used in all different ways, and none of them are very meaningful. But for some reason, people understand it. So let's ask us the question, is Luke 16 literal? Well, technically, yes, because it is literature. So it is literal. But that's not really what they're asking, right? What they're really asking is that when you die, do you actually go to a place that has actual flames of fire and heat and burning and writhing in pain, and you're asking for water, actual drops of water, H2O, to be put on your actual tongue by the actual finger of an actual person? Is that what hell looks like? Now, that's a hard question. I sympathize with both sides. So let's look at one side first. There is a lot of problems with looking at that language as not being metaphorical. There's a lot of problems with that. So let's think about them for a second. Don't shut down just because, all your life you've heard that this would be horrible to even think this way. Just think about it for a second. When a person dies, we know their body is in the grave, and what we call their spirit or their soul, depending on how you want to classify it, won't get into that distinction, but you have your spirit, your soul, that we believe goes somewhere. Doesn't dissipate, and it doesn't disappear, and it isn't, just goes down into the dirt. Even Solomon said that, right? He says it looks like you die like an animal. It looks like your spirit just goes in the dirt, but we know that's not the case. The spirit goes back to the God who created it. Even Solomon understood this. All the biblical authors understood this, that there is a fundamental difference between all other life forms and human beings. Okay? So, but whatever that is, that spirit, it goes somewhere. Where does it go? Does it go to a physical place with physical fire? And if it's not physical, how can it have fire? Fire requires fuel and oxygen and a heat source. Do we have that? Where the spirits are? What's the fuel? What's the heat? Where's the oxygen, right? That creates. So we have chemical reactions in the spiritual afterlife. I'm not trying to be cute or dismissive, but these are the problems that you have when you say this is quote unquote literal. Does the spirit have a tongue? Well, where's that? So is it like some Christian preachers or teachers have said that the spirit is actually like a complete shape of your body inside your body? Like this is a shell, and then the spirit is like is just like complete, has tongue and teeth and fingernails. You trim the fingernails? I mean, we could ask these questions on and on and on and on. This is the difficulty that they have when they look at this. Because Christians are asserting, right, affirming, this is literal. This is literal. Well, there's some real problems with that. If you want to look at it in any logically coherent way, there's some difficulties there. Do they have eyes? How do the eyes work? Do you have perfect vision at that time? You don't need glasses anymore? How does all this work? Well, that's all. Well, these are the questions you open when we say it's literal. So I understand that. I don't have answers for these things. I'm not saying these things like there's some answer. To me, that's very difficult. I look at that, and these are the difficulties I have with seeing it as not metaphorical, or not reusing physical language to describe spiritual realities. However, how do I know it's not literal? This is my problem with people on that side. I get it. And if you think that maybe I was saying all that because I'm with them, I'm really not, but I do get it. But at the same time, how do I know? Just because it seems incoherent to me right now doesn't mean anything. Who am I? Let me give you an example of this type of reasoning and why we got to be very careful with being moved too much. There's nothing wrong with looking at things logically and wanting things to be coherent. We are given logical brains. I think we're supposed to use them. But we got to be very careful. I'll give you an example of why we should be careful. Jesus has a conversation with the Sadducees. They're convinced there's no resurrection. No resurrection. Because think about it, they say. I mean, let's just think about it for a moment. A woman has 7 husbands in her lifetime and dies without children. Whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Case closed. Drop the mic. And for years, the Pharisees had hit their head against the wall on that. The Sadducees, they were full of themselves. They knew it. No one could defeat their reasoning because it was logically incoherent to be a resurrection. Jesus comes to them and says, you don't know the scriptures and you don't know the power of God. You have no idea what you're talking about, is what he said. You have no idea what you're talking about. And then he just, in one sentence, he just kills who knows how many centuries of work on this theory they had. He just like squashed it like a little bug. And he says, in the resurrection, there is no marriage. Oh, I would have loved to have been there for that. It's like, oh, take that. Oh, like when the rappers that do their little thing and they're like, oh. You just see him walking away, everyone's slapping his hands. It's like, yes, I love it. It's great. He's telling them, sure, I understand. You're looking at it logically. Great. But you don't have all the information. You just don't have you don't know what you're talking about. So when we look at this and I can ask you all these questions and you can't answer them. Look, I could tie you into knots looking at that and you say, it's literal. I could tie you into knots and punch you full of holes. And you say, well, I guess neither one of us has any clue what we're talking about. We just don't know what we're talking about. I am perfectly open to finding out that what Jesus did is he took all these normal words that describe physical realities and he repurposed them to paint you a picture, an abstract picture of what it'll look like from that perspective, hell in heaven or hell in paradise. I would have no problem with that. None whatsoever. I also have no problem to find out that it's all literal. How do I know? I just have no idea. Sure, it doesn't fit I look at it logically and I think, none of this fits logically. This is very incoherent. I can find all kinds of problems with it, and it's probably metaphorical. I have no idea. None whatsoever. I have no firsthand experience either. I will tell you this. Let's look at it this way. And this is how I tend to look at it, not because I think it's necessarily the right way, but because it's the only way that works for me. And that is that I think that what Jesus is doing is he, from his firsthand knowledge, is painting a painting as close as he can with the colors you can see of what eternity looks like. That means that there is torment, there is consciousness. All the things he describes, there is. There is something that we would equate as fire, we would equate as burning, we would equate as thirst, discomfort, all the elements he portrays. If we could look at them, if our eyes, let's say that if our eyes could take in that spectrum of light, the spirit that would reflect off spiritual reality, that's what it would look like if it were described in the physical spectrum of light. You understand what I'm saying? Now, we can't see that spectrum. We can only see the spectrum of light that we're familiar with. And so it's put into words that we're familiar with. Does not mean it doesn't actually exist. It doesn't mean it's less actual or less real at all. Does it actually have a chemical reaction that we classify as fire? Or is there a spiritual truth that if we were to compare it to something, say, what does that look like in our world? We'd say, well, it looks a lot like fire. Feels like fire. That's how I do it. Now, that does not mean that's the way it is. It could actually have burning logs there for all I know. I have no idea. Never been there. I hope to never find out. I'm okay with that ignorance. Not interested. I don't need no firsthand account of that. I'm good. There's some ambiguity that we should just be good with, right? Just it's okay. I'm much more interested in finding out what paradise is like. That's more interest. That's more my speed. So that's how I look at Revelation the same way. I look at the book of Revelation the same way. John is seeing something, and he is portraying it, describing it in words, in terms, and ideas and concepts that we can understand. And you say, well, then it's not true. No, it's absolutely true. Just like it's true when the Native Americans saw the Europeans on their big boats for the first time and described them as coming over on huge turtles. Did the Europeans actually not show up? It's all a figment of their imagination because they didn't have the technical terminology right? Well, no, that's ridiculous. They used words they understood and described things, and it is just as historically accurate as if they had used technically accurate words. We do this all the time. I'm homesick. Really? Does that mean anything? Technically, I mean? You're sick of your house? What does that mean technically? There's a home in your family. It's like none of this. If you look at it technically, that's a silly terminology. I'm heartbroken. What does that mean? But we all know what those things mean. They mean something. Now, a cardiologist, if he was going to be uppity, he would tell you, you're full of it. None of that's possible. Therefore, it's not real. Puppy love. I could go all day and give you terminology we use all the time. Educated people use it because it means something. The words don't reflect the meaning very accurately, but they do in our collective conscious. That's how the words in the scriptures are used. That's why it's important to have an historical appreciation of the writing, because they are writing in terminologies that meant something. They're using phrases that meant something other than what each word technically means. Often. I think that's what Luke 16 is. What I am most assured of And then each of you will have to make your own judgments for yourself. But for myself, what I am most assured of is that what Christ describes is actual, it's real. I say that for a number of reasons. One is there is no indication in there that he is being parabolic or metaphorical. There's no indication that it's sarcasm or irony or any other rhetorical device. There's nothing in that text that I can find that indicates it to be any more than a straightforward depiction of eternity. Not only that, but he talks about the seriousness and the reality of eternity in other places and says it is horrible. He says you're better off in this life plucking out your eye and cutting off your hand than going to hell. So you may quibble with whether or not there is a physical chemical reaction called fire there, but you're missing the point. The point is you'd be better off maimed, dumb, deaf, and blind now than to lose your soul in hell. So you can quibble over whether or not he was technically accurate, but according to Jesus, there'll be no quibbling later. You'll wish it was chemical fire. There is no place where Jesus ever spoke where he puts any doubt whatsoever on his assurance that a place like hell exists and that it is every bit as horrible as Luke 16 depicts it, or worse. Nowhere. There's nowhere where he makes any allusion whatsoever that there's a lack of consciousness, a ceasing to exist. None of that. Christ is universally clear in his teachings on the afterlife. Paradise, what we call heaven, the Abraham's bosom, that's real. Hell is real. And whatever you could possibly do to avoid hell is worth doing. Now, sadly, there's nothing you can do to avoid hell. Nothing at all. You can cut off all your hands and all your feet and pluck out all your eyes and put a hot searing iron down your ear canal on both sides. And you're going to find out that the reason you sin isn't because it's in your hand or your eyes or your ears, but it's in your heart. And it's not the heart a cardiologist can get to. There's nothing we can do about it. Doesn't mean that it's not a real place. So you better find a solution. And I'm out of time. So that gives you something to ponder on.